My name is Dr. Chris Jenkins, and I am the CEO of the Orianne Society and the host of the Snake Talk podcast, the podcast where you learn about nature's most feared, maligned, and persecuted animals. I invite you to listen to this conversation, and maybe you'll find that what you perceive as fear is actually rooted in a deep fascination. Welcome to the Snake Talk podcast. I am excited for this one because we are going to talk about one of my favorite animals on the planet, the Great Basin Rattlesnake. As many of you know, this is the species that I did my doctoral research on and, worked on during postdocs and have continued to stay involved with for a long time. So I'm excited about this conversation. I'm always rattlesnakes that live at real kind of environmental extremes, high latitudes, high elevations, and their life history and ecology has always really fascinated me. These snakes living on the edge, and so I'm excited today because we have two gentlemen, Bryan and Colton, who I'll introduce you to in a minute, but they have been working on these snakes and for quite some time, and not too far away from where I worked in Idaho, but two long-term data sets on the same species, which I would argue is one of the less studied rattlesnake species in North America. So I'm excited to have this conversation. I think I'm going to learn a lot. I think there'll be some interesting kind of comparing and contrasting on the ecology of these animals in much different environments. So I'm excited. Well, welcome to the podcast, Bryan and Colton. How are you guys doing today?
I'm doing good. Thanks, Chris, for having me.
I'm also doing well. Thanks. Appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah, no problem. I like to start all our episodes and introduce our guests and just learn a little bit about who they are and how they got to where they are. So why don't we start with you, Bryan, and why don't you just tell us a little bit about how this interest in snakes came about and how you find yourself sitting at this great national park working on snakes today?
I've been working with rattlesnakes since I was 15, so over 30 years now. And I started in Southern Ohio working with timber rattlesnakes and Eastern Massasaugas. And I moved out west about 25 years ago. And lo and behold, rattlesnakes were maybe the most common snake out of here. And I fell in love with the park in the Western U.S. and all the rattlesnake diversity, and was able to do a graduate program on rattlesnakes out here in Eastern Nevada.
So how did you? So today you still reside in Eastern Nevada, and you actually work for the Park Service, and the location we're going to be talking about, Great Basin National Park. So what is your role at the park, and how did you end up kind of getting into that position?
Well, I started right out of undergraduate. I started at the park doing cave tours at Lehman Caves, and then I moved into being a fisheries biologist, and then I was able to do reptile inventories for the park. Became the wildlife biologist, finished my master's and PhD programs, and then eventually I became the natural and cultural resource program manager, which is what I'm doing now.
Excellent. And so that affords you, in that position, you've been able to continue your work with rattlesnakes, it sounds like, and a variety of other things as well.
I have, yeah. So now I'm in. I deal with cultural resources, cave management, fire management, fisheries, bighorn sheep. But the nice part of that is I'm able to keep our rattlesnake program going. It's up and coming young herpetologists like Colton are able to get out there and continue this monitoring work.
Yeah, great. Well, that's a good transition, Colton. Let's transition over to you. Why don't you? So you mentioned you're a graduate student and working in the park, and but why don't you just tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of where you came from and how you ended up getting into snakes and finding yourself sitting here in Great Basin National Park studying rattlesnakes.
Oh, I'd love to. Thank you, Chris. I was born and raised in Nevada, and moved to Reno for college. Started undergrad at University of Nevada, Reno, and graduated from UNR in fall of 2020. Took 2.5 years off after I graduated then to work for some environmental consulting firms as well as for USGS on giant garter snakes that are endangered or threatened. I guess now at this point, not sure where their like status lies right now with that species. But I worked with giant garter snakes in California for 6 months, and then soon after that, I decided to go back to school at UNR, and I'm currently in my second year right now of my master's.
Gotcha. So did you always know going back to grad school that you wanted to work on rattlesnakes, or is that a kind of project that existed and you fell into it, or something you kind of worked to find? How did that all come together for you?
Oh yes. So yeah, I've been really fascinated with herpetofauna ever since I was like 12 years old, and growing up in a small rural town, Winnemucca, you catch a lot of. I mean, there's really not much to do, and so you're spending most of your time catching snakes, lizards, and all that. So I definitely grew up, just being a herper at heart and a herper to like my friends and family. And I've always admired rattlesnakes too for a long time, and never thought I'd have the chance to work with them for a master's project. But I honestly have to say that Great Basins are certainly my favorite rattlesnake by far. Same for you, Chris. But certainly speckled rattlesnakes are a close second for me. But yeah, I definitely do admire
Mhm.
this particular species in just terms of the types of variation there are of this wonderful creature.
Yeah, great. Well, one of the things that really interests me about the project you guys are working on is the place you're working on it. So where I was working in Idaho, we were on the interior Columbia Basin, further north, but sounds like probably in most places a little bit lower elevation, kind of in a flat Snake River plain. Um, Kind of a relatively low topography landscape, except for some buttes and things of that nature. But I know Great Basin National Park. Well, I should back up and say I've been to most of the significant national parks in the United States, and Great Basin, even though I lived in that region for quite a while, is one of the ones that I haven't visited. But I've researched it and looked at pictures, and the landscapes are just incredible. Lots of mountains, and so I'm really fascinated to learn about this snake's ecology in this in this particular environment. But I guess before we start talking about the snake and then diving into some of the long term research, maybe Bryan, you'd be good to start this off, and Colton can jump in as needed. But maybe introduce us to this landscape a little bit, because I think it's kind of the it's a tapestry on which we're going to paint the ecology of this animal, and just want people to understand it a little bit better, because it's different than a lot of the range of the Great Basin rattlesnake.
Sure. So the Great Basin is this vast area between the Sierra Nevada range to the west and the Wasatch Mountains to the east. It's bounded on the north by the Columbia River Plateau, and then on the south by the Mojave Desert. And it's really a series of basins. So it's not just one big basin. There's mountain range valley, mountain range valley, mountain range valley. The Earth's being stretched apart there, and that's what causes the topography. Nevada is actually the most mountainous state in the country, which most people wouldn't realize that. And right in the middle of that is Great Basin National Park, and it consists of the Snake Range and Snake Valley, and it's appropriately named because it's really remote and it supports really good snake diversity. Um, and that landscape, it ranges from about 4,800 feet elevation above sea level, all the way up to 13,000 feet, which is the peak of Wheeler Peak, is at that elevation. So there's a really cool elevational gradient, and there's also a really amazing gradient in precipitation, climate, and resource availability. So these snakes that are living, at 4,800 feet in the valley bottoms, it's a pretty harsh place. Maybe they're getting 4 or 5 inches of precipitation a year, versus the snakes up in our study site up in the park at 8,000 feet, probably getting more like 12 to 14 inches of precip a year. So the resources are quite different there. And it goes from almost no vegetation in the valleys, just some grasses and some really low shrubs, all the way up into coniferous forests, tree line. It includes some of the oldest living things on the planet, bristlecone pines, which can live to be 5,000 years old. A lot of caves in the area. The park itself has about 40 caves, and rattlesnakes love that karst topography. It's a really great place to spend the winter and hide from predators and find prey into. Another neat thing about the park is even though we're in a desert, the Great Basin is the largest desert in North America. Most of the precipitation comes as snow, and so it's that snow melts, and there's even a glacier in the park, and that snow and glacial melt supports these streams, which then flow through our study sites. And as you might imagine, that's just an incredible resource for these animals. It's cooler, it's more humid, there's lots of cover, and there's more prey. And it's kind of neat to see how the animals live in a place like that relative to that really harsh desert where there's I imagine some of these snakes go years without encountering surface water, and they get all their water from their prey. Maybe some rainstorms here and there, but those are only separated by less than 10 miles. It's a very different world if you're a Great Basin rattlesnake in those two different environments, and that's one of the things that fascinates me about it is just how much contrast there are for these animals that really thrive in those environments.
Yeah. What's we'll get into some more of this as we start talking about their ecology, but what's kind of the elevation record for a Great Basin that you've seen in the park? How far are they going all the way up into these like coniferous forests? I'm assuming maybe you have some aspen forests and other things of that nature. Do you find them up there or?
Yeah, we've got a record at Wheeler Peak at 13,000 feet, which it's kind of mind blowing. It seems
Wow.
like they probably don't den much above 8,000
Yeah.
feet. But as Colton can attest to, they migrate
Hmm.
all the way up to tree line and use those resources all, yeah, throughout the active season.
Yeah, oh, that's amazing. Well, and the other thing I'd ask you, I know we're going to dive more into the ecology here, but I'm just curious. Um, do you know much about the difference? So a lot of my dissertation work was focused on like the life history of the snake and how, in that case, how disturbance was impacting it through small mammal communities and thermal environments. But that life history endpoint there, looking at things like, I don't know, pregnancy intervals and ages to maturity and all these types of things, growth rates and so on. That's it's quite a different environment over a very short period. I mean, do you know much, even if it's just anecdotal, about say some of these snakes that you have overwintering at 8,000 feet, maybe going up to forage at 10 plus, and then you've got these snakes down in the valley bottom? Are the snakes, say, in the valley growing faster, for example, maturing earlier? Do you know any of those types of things? Or
Yeah, we kind of looked into that for my dissertation, and the growing season's probably shorter at the higher elevations, although that windows one thing we're finding is a stronger early emergence signal that on average every year they're emerging 2 or 3 days earlier, and over 20 years that's just an amazing push for increase in the amount of the active season. That even since you did your research, Chris,
yeah,
those Snake River snakes are just seeing they have a much bigger window to work in. They seem to get
yeah,
bigger at
I
the
bet.
higher elevations. There's probably a lot more resources up there. They can feed, they grow faster. Um, my kind of working hypothesis is it's a live fast, die young. If you're up high, there's more resources and you can grow faster, reproduce more, but it's much more predator rich. Um, Down in these valleys, the snakes seem to live
Okay,
longer, but they grow a lot slower. And it's maybe a little easier place to avoid predators because it's such a low productivity environment.
gotcha. Huh. Interesting. So, yeah, and so it sounds like the national park is it kind of like one central mountain range? So the park, the way it lays, is kind of like low elevation, very quickly going up to high elevation and back on the other side, or is it kind of more of a complex network of mountains and ranges?
It's really the park is really the top of the South Snake Range, so it kind of cuts the mountain in half. Basically, it's a sky island out here in the desert, um, but it sort of
Okay.
cuts off those low elevation places. And I've been able to extend our work, along this elevational gradient down below the park, so we could look at some of these lower elevation populations. Um, so it's sort of a mix of protected areas. Most of the land out here is public, which is really good for for access, and generally it's better for snakes to be on public lands than not. And one of the great things out here is it's super isolated, so there aren't a lot of people out here to kill rattlesnakes, even though people are still the biggest
Hmm.
mortality cause. Just the isolation gives these guys a good chance of living. We've got lots of snakes that have lived over 20 years, and that's about how long our study's going. So it seems like 20 or 25 is kind of their upper age limit. Um, but I attribute a lot of that just to the like isolation and the lack of roads and the lack of people.
Hmm. I mean, despite again kind of being one of these big premier national parks in my mind, what type of visitation do you get, per year, say relative to some other parks people might think about?
Yeah, that's a great question. Isolation's good for that too. We're one of the least visited national parks. Although since I've been here, our visitation's doubled. So we get about 150,000 people a year. And you can contrast that to, Zion or Grand Canyon, which gets several million, 2 or 3 million people a year. Um,
Hmm.
so we're a pretty low impact park in terms of visitation.
Yeah. Okay. Great. Well, let's transition start talking a little bit more about the snake. And um, you know, all of us here on the phone are pretty familiar with this species, so probably understand their general ecology pretty well. But why don't we just kind of have a conversation about that first, and then we can kind of get into some of the specifics, say from the long-term mark recapture work you've been doing, Bryan, or your graduate work, Colton. But I kind of in the beginning, I described my interest in these snakes that live at um, extremes, high latitudes, high elevations, and I certainly put Great Basins in that category. Living in an extreme environment for a rattlesnake. So, um, really, maybe I mean either of you can kind of kick it off, but um, let's just talk about Great Basin rattlesnakes. I mean, first of all, what do these things look like compared to maybe some of the other species that people might be familiar with?
Yeah, sure thing, Chris. So yeah, with the variety of Great Basin rattlesnakes we have here in the park, there is so many different color morphs to these guys that consist of tannish, tan color, brown, sometimes like olive green or like light green, and then we have some really unique like dark morphs of Great Basin rattlesnakes that have their bodies like basically their entire body are like entire body are melanistic, um, that consist of like their unique patterning or markings to them on their dorsal side of hexagonal or hourglass shape that you could say too. But we also find that within these dark morphs, there are like a dorsal stripe going down there, basically like the back of the snake, which is really unique in the sense of how we have like a really cool dark coloration of rattlesnake here that I haven't seen anywhere else before. While living in Nevada, central and northern Nevada, haven't seen really many unique dark colorations like that in the Great Basin. But certainly, I've seen other really unique colors too within just the markings that they have, but also just to like the head like markings too that they express. Showing that little mask that they wear on their heads with like a line going across from like one eye to the other. It's just really unique in terms of like the species that like there's just so much like very specific and minute details that go into this species into like how their coloration is designed. And so uh, we definitely do have other really cool color morphs of just a lot of variation with that. But I find that the dark coloration within the Great Basins that we have are just really really special to me. In and how like I would like to see more Great Basins like this too. But I know that I haven't even been to Utah yet, or Zion, or like the like Red Rock area to see like the Great Basins there basically match the colors of the rocks. So I would definitely like to see one of those different color morphs of Great Basins as well in Utah. But I really think that the that Great Basins are just like really vibrant and have so much to offer in terms of their coloration that some people don't quite don't quite like realize right away from this species. So
Yeah, that's interesting. We don't up in the Snake River Plain. We didn't have that. Sounds like really dark morph. I mean, we had some animals that had dark chevrons, in particularly some big males would get that. I'm curious if you guys saw, like, after studying them for 10 some odd years. Um, I noticed like a sexual dimorphism in between in colors, and in particular females were very similar on average. We had some males that would look like the females, but I mean, I get to the point where I didn't even have to look at kind of tail lengths from a distance. Like, at least with adult snakes, I could pretty accurately sex them by just looking at the color, even from a distance. Have you noticed anything like that down there at the national park, or no?
I honestly haven't particularly noticed that in some of the species, but I know that Brian might have seen that. I know that certainly within like larger males that I've captured and have tracked, like they're certainly really light in coloration, compared to some of the females, where the females can be also um, light or dark in some sense, but yeah, not quite really, not quite knowing exactly like what would distinguish between the two sexes there, of male and females, but finding out like larger males definitely are certainly more vibrant, I would say, than some of the females. But I don't know if Brian, if you wanted to jump in and say anything on that.
Yeah, that sounds pretty close. Um, we notice a lot of differences with habitat because you go from forest to salt flat. So the ones in the mountains tend to be a lot darker,
Hmm.
and I'd agree the females are kind of like a drabber, what one sort of color, and then the males are a lot more contrasty. We have been photographing all the individuals for the last 4 or 5 years to look at that, and also to look at the ontogenetic color change because they're all born pretty
Hmm.
much identical with color and pattern, and then they undergo this pretty drastic shift as they mature.
Yeah. Huh. Interesting. Well, so we talked a little bit about what they look like. How about size wise? As far as a rattlesnake species go, maybe comparing and contrasting it to some of the other species people might know. How big are the snakes you guys see down there in the national park?
With the Great Basins that I've come in contact here so far within the 2 years of my study is that males reach roughly between like 400 and six, like almost 700 grams. We did have one particular individual that is really dear to my heart too, that I tracked for a long time, and really enjoyed just kind of like monitoring his specific movement behavior um, all last year and then partially this year as well. Finding that he almost reached 700 grams by the end of last activity season in 2023, and found that, man, he was like the biggest snake that I ever had in my sample size. And knowing that there were large like males that were also about the same weight as him, that were full grown adults, roughly like being close to that weight as well, and being older snakes too, and in particular going back to like Brian's you know um, archives dating way back to the early 2000s, of finding like some large males reaching to be like to be 550 to 600 grams at most, for these particular like males that get to that average size. But going to the early 2000s 20-year-old Great Basin rattlesnakes that seem to show a lot of unique quality and like quantity of the size too, of the males reaching that those lengths for that. And then finding our females too, seeing that they basically get to like a average size of like 300 grams, but some occasionally like reaching 400 that I have in my sample size as well. And really like finding out that there's certainly like that, you know, that break in between the size of sexes, that, females won't technically, from what I've seen anyway, females after like 450 grams, like or close to 450 grams, you don't really hardly see as much. But certainly males reaching up to like 500, 600 grams. But Bryan could certainly have like other ways of saying how like the sexes are definitely different for that. So
Bryan, if you could add to that and talk about their lengths a little bit too, if you would.
Snakes are one of the most persecuted groups of animals in the world, but we are dedicated to changing that. If you like what we've been discussing here on the Snake Talk podcast, here's an opportunity to turn that inspiration into action. Head over to www.orian.org and explore how you can support the Orian Society. Click on Take Action on our menu to make a difference.
I'd describe them as an average size rattlesnake as a species goes. A really big male out here is 40 inches. And in my area, I think 44 is pretty much the top end. They get a little bigger on the fringes, like around the Wasatch Front and down on the Mojave Desert ecotone. But anything over 40 inches is a really big rattlesnake here compared to, timber rattlesnakes or even prairie rattlesnakes. And I think some of it's resource availability. When they have more food, the males can definitely get bigger. Up in the mountains here, the biggest ones tend to be up in the canyons, up in the mountains. Yeah, pretty typical. The males are much bigger than females. They continue growing throughout their lives, whereas the females, once they reach reproductive age, they just kind of lock into reproductive mode, and all that excess energy goes into having babies and litters. And so they just kind of become these, bags of babies where they reach a certain length and they put on weight and then they lose it with parturition. So yeah, a big female's 36 inches out here.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Interesting. Well, so, a lot of this you've learned, Bryan, through this long-term mark recapture work that you've been doing. And I want to talk a little bit about their life history. Again, I've mentioned it multiple times. The work in the snake river plain that I did and estimating all these life history characteristics. And it always fascinated me, the life history of snakes that live at these real extreme environments. And so I'm curious, first of all, maybe just tell the audience a little bit about the mark recapture data set, when you started it and what prompted it, maybe some of the techniques that you might use. But then, I'd be curious to know what you've learned about their population biology, anything from like growth rates to, body conditions of snakes to pregnancy intervals and times to maturity, all those types of things. Just curious what you've been able to learn from their life history from this amazing data set you've been collecting.
Sure, I'd love to. So Great Basin, it's a desert. It's a cold desert, and it's really high elevation. So everything about this species is really centered around surviving the winter, the long, cold winters out here, which can be brutally extreme. And so they're really locked into these communal hibernacula, and site fidelity is really high. So Great Basin rattlesnake almost never tries to find a new den after it's found one where it spent the winter, and that fidelity is perfect for mark recapture studies because every year they're coming back to the same place, and by doing that, you're able to catch the same individuals year after year, and you can catch them in pretty good numbers, and it's just the perfect setup for a mark recapture study. So back in about 2000, I started doing mark recapture clip and ventral scales. And then in 2004, I switched to pit tags, started adding pit tags. And we probably have close to 1,000 individuals in the study. It's a little different, Chris, than your dens on the Snake River in that there are some big dens with maybe 100, 150 individuals in it, but a lot of the dens are pretty small or less than 50. But there's a lot of them on the landscape. So I think we monitor about 12 dens,
Okay.
and yeah, we've got several thousand recaptures. Worked it through the Cormac Jolly Sieber models, and survival is about 80 to 85%. It fluctuates depending on the year. An old individual is 20 plus years. Growth rates vary quite a bit by site. So the lower elevation sites, its growth rate's a lot slower than the higher elevation sites. They, as you might expect, they don't mature until they're probably 3 to 5 years old. Both the females and the males, and then they reproduce maybe every 3 to 5 year intervals after that. One of the interesting effects of climate change, especially on these high elevation ectotherms, is that the winters used to probably be a really limiting factor. So not unusual to be in hibernation for 6 to 8 months of the year and really only have a 4 or 5 month active season. But that active season's really spread out as the climates have warmed. Spring comes earlier, summer comes sooner. There's a longer window that they can forage. And so presumably that can increase growth rates and potentially reproductive rates too.
Interesting. And so, and you mentioned those survival rates. That's across all captures. That's not for adults, or I'm assuming you're catching more adults than young snakes. But those survival rates around in the 80s. That's for the entire data set.
That's the whole data set. Interestingly, there weren't a lot going on with male-female differences. So you might expect like males would have a lower survival rate because they're risk takers, or you might think, well, females put so much into reproduction, they probably have that impacts their survival rate because they have a litter and they're literally on the verge of starvation, and then they have to go to hibernation. So there really wasn't any male-female difference, which is a little perplexing because our sex ratios are really heavily male biased. And was that in the Snake River? You had pretty even sex ratios, if I remember.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, they were slightly skewed, but I mean, and it depended on the den complexes. But in general, yeah. I mean, you could say they were, approximately even. So, um, yeah, that's interesting. The male bias. I mean, which would possibly point to maybe, I don't know, more of a cost of, parturition, giving birth and postpartum type survival being more important, maybe in that high elevation, colder environment. I don't know. That's interesting. But they also have more food there. I'm just kind of spitballing now, but it's interesting. And that actually really surprised me right from the beginning. I think it's fascinating. But the concept that your snakes at the higher elevation, where they actually probably have a shorter active season, although it sounds like it's not that much shorter. They're growing faster and doing all those things. That's fascinating to me. But so you're marking these animals. You said you have about 12 sites that you're monitoring, and you've been doing it for, what'd you say, probably going on 20, 25 years, something like that. So that's quite a data set. Any other things that you've kind of picked up over those long-term studies about the snakes population? Have you noticed any kind of, we used to always monitor, I'm assuming you're measuring and weighing these snakes. We've talked about that a little bit. Have you noticed any patterns maybe in their body condition relative to, say in the females, like pregnancy? So for example, we found out, learned that at a given den complex that, the proportion of females that were gravid a year, kind of became synchronized, and you almost started to see this like cycle of when females would be pregnant, at least the largest proportion of them. You ever see any patterns like that, or any other body condition patterns that you think could be explained by, say, food resources or anything like that?
Yeah, some interesting those kind of patterns. We called it pile up years, where lots of the gravid females kind of all give birth together. Maybe it's sort of a swamping strategy. But out here, it takes precipitation kind of drives everything, and it's a little bit counterintuitive to the east where I used to work with timber rattlesnakes. But you have really good resource pulse years where you have water, and then that water gets converted to vegetation. But small mammals convert it, the vegetation into snake prey, and then the snakes are feeding on those mammals. So there's usually a couple year lag between gravid females and good precipitation years because it takes a while for those resources to make it up the food chain. And a lot of people want to put together, oh, it was a good snake year. There's good water year, so was it a good snake year? Well, it takes years for that water to get converted into snake biomass, but eventually, yeah, it's pretty cyclic, and it's amazing how they can survive droughts. I didn't find any real drought signals in survival, although I think it's there, but it's really hard to starve a rattlesnake, so they can really do well in these really bad years, just by hunkering down, limiting their movements, and they only need a few meals a year to maintain, their basal metabolic needs. So that's been one kind of interesting thing, is that drought really impacts reproduction, but it doesn't seem to impact survival much. Adult survival. Now, adult and juvenile survival were really quite similar, but the young a year survival, after they make it through a hibernation period, those snakes have really low survival, almost half of what the adults have. And if you see them, they're born, they're like 9 grams. They're just these tiny, like such vulnerable little snake babies. And so it kind of makes sense that if they make it through their first year, they do pretty well. But in that first year, they're really vulnerable, potentially to starvation. But also, I think they're really vulnerable to predators in that first year after birth.
Yeah, I always had that impression too. I mean, they're just such a small snake as a neonate, and there's so many things out in these environments looking for a meal. So, um, exactly. Well, so you mentioned gestation sites. So in the snake river plain sites, we would see. Um, they were typically using some kind of rock feature that would allow them, like many rattlesnake species, that would allow them to kind of maintain relatively high body temperature, pretty much day and night. Oftentimes, those features were closer to the overwintering sites than, say, an average female's like foraging ground or whatever it might be. So I'm just curious. What gestation looked like for these animals? Is it kind of the same thing where they have certain kind of rocky features that would be in maybe closer proximity to overwintering sites than some other resources, or is it a different system?
It's pretty similar, Chris. They tend to give birth closer to the dens, and there are definitely places where they aggregate, and they don't just use them for gestation. They also use them for mating sites. We used to call them sex rocks because they were just these, kind of like singles bars for rattlesnakes where the snakes are moving in and out. One of the observations I had, it really changed the way I thought about rattlesnakes. I used to really think of them really, as kind of these cold-blooded, lizard brain animals that everything about them was dictated by resource availability, mating, food availability, temperature. And I had this female that I tracked, and she went up to one of these gestation sites, had her babies, went back to her hibernaculum, and they drop about 50% of their weight when they give birth. So she was 250 grams. After birthing, she was less than 150 grams, literally on the verge of starvation. The next year, she emerged from hibernation. She went back to that gestation rock and hung out for about 2 weeks. No biological reason. Left that rock and went out to forage. And then on the way back to hibernation, she stopped back in at that rock, hung out for a week or two, and then she went back to hibernation. And that really changed the way I viewed rattlesnakes as more of these sentient, extremely social animals. They're not just in it only for their own benefit. They're actually, sentient creatures that seem to enjoy each other's company and like to visit with each other. That was just one of those events that it just really shifted my thinking as a rattlesnake biologist.
Yeah, that's interesting. And we are seeing, in a number of different ways, people learning aspects about rattlesnake behavior that kind of is surprising people in that vein. And actually, I think not even for people like us who care about these animals, but just for the general public. I mean, some of the things that they're learning about, whatever it might be, parental care, or just some of these observations, like you were just talking about, that shows. I always say, snakes are animals too, like that, to the average public, that, oh, these are animals that are doing things that aren't just, like you said, lizard brain. And so, yeah, I think those types of observations are great. Well, let's, we've talked a lot about the kind of the den sites and the gestation sites and proximity there. Let's talk a little bit about how these snakes move. And I'm very interested in this because, it's a much different environment. You've got a lot more topography than we had in the Snake River Plain. There was kind of micro topography, but in general, if you were to like get up in the air and look at the movement trajectories of snakes in Idaho, where I was studying, it would almost look like, if you had like a central overwintering site, it would almost look like a wagon wheel with snakes moving out, making very linear, relatively fast, long distance migrations, and then kind of set almost like a wagon wheel with like lollipop sticking out of out of the end, and those lollipops being some form of like an area that most of the foraging snakes would settle down in and feed. And so they really kind of went almost every direction. And so I'm just curious, you get a lot different topography there. Maybe this might be a good one for you to start with, Colton, but how did, when these animals, say, come out in the spring and they're moving out, say, to forage or go to gestation sites or shedding sites or whatever it might be, what do the movements look like in these snakes?
Whether you're passionate about preserving biodiversity, ensuring the survival of threatened species, or simply want to contribute to a healthier planet, there's a role for you. Your support isn't just a contribution, it's an investment in a future where our ecosystems thrive. Go to www.orian.org to donate or become a member today.
Yeah, Chris, I can totally help explain with that. That's basically what I have been doing. Like, this entire study now is just basically tracking where the rattlesnakes go using radio telemetry. And that's basically every day what I do is just track snakes with my field technician as well, trying to basically track each individual twice a week if possible. But now at this point, we are up to tracking up to 29 Great Basin rattlesnakes that consist of 15 males and 14 females that we are tracking since this study began last year. But yeah, just finding out that that all, like, these snakes, they den together for the most part. I think a majority of all of my like 29 snakes that we're currently tracking have certainly come from like really big dens that they have found to like merge out of them at some point, and then all seem to go into the same general direction of like wherever that may be, to like find a rookery, or like to link up with a mate, or to just go to more. We find that we see that a lot of our snakes do like to occupy rocky talus sites, which is awesome for like most of our snakes that are even migrating from, like, say, a few canyons or ridges over. We'll find these like migratory corridors on like saddles that we found like on saddles on ridges, that a lot of snakes would just come up and over a ridge to go into a watershed, basically to link up with potential mates coming from current hibernaculum in rocky talus. So we find that to be a lot of the case in some of our canyons, where a lot of our males definitely go way beyond to try to find their significant other. But we also find that there's some males and some other snakes that kind of like are stragglers that take a while for them to leave their dens and to go wherever they basically can potentially find a mate. That I think to myself, well, I don't know why they're going in that direction, because there's just, I feel like there's no like historical den sites over there for that reason. But they find mates though for what for like for that, speaking of like females finding the males too in regards to that. So they just somehow end up linking up with a mate that they find eventually at some point that is just way out of range or out of their I guess constant migratory path that we notice when we're tracking these guys. And some of them go above and beyond to great lengths to find their mates that they just don't seem to. That seems to baffle me most of the time where they go.
Yeah. So you're saying that unlike what we saw in Idaho, it sounds like you're seeing more directional movement, where we were primarily seeing movement almost in all directions. It sounds like you're seeing more directional movement, and then you spent a lot of time talking about male mate searching, and we would see that kind of with males late in the summer. They would kind of they would go, first of all, they would migrate, set up like a foraging ground for a good part of the summer. And then they would later in the summer start to make these longer, more erratic movements. And, looking for females. And, yeah, so interesting. That sounds like there's some interesting differences there, some similarities. And so you said you tracked, about 50-50 males and females. So with the females, were you tracking all non-gravid females, or were you also tracking gravid females?
Um, yes. So we are tracking gravid females. I know that recently I picked up on how to palpate a female earlier this year, so I have a way better understanding now on how to palpate a female to see if it has embryos inside of her or not. But I definitely know last year we had several of our females that were gravid. That one individual in particular was coming from a den site that didn't travel far as much, and I think was carrying maybe like 9 to 10 follicles inside of her. And she basically went up to the edge of the road and then just decided to shed her skin there real quick, and then turn back around to go to her den for the hibernation period. And this all happened last year during summer of 2023. And then I found out like this summer, tracking her and seeing how her migratory pattern changed exponentially, like greater to lengths that she traveled further this year as compared to last year, where I suppose that she gave birth really close to her den, and so she stuck really close to her den last summer to give birth and whatnot. That sadly, I wish I was there to witness, her babies when she was giving birth to them, but I guess I just sadly missed that window of opportunity. But then seeing how just dramatically her distance traveled this year was much greater than it was last year. That she covered a lot more ground this year as opposed to last year when she was gravid.
Mhm. Yeah, that's interesting. It sounds similar to to a lot of rattlesnake species, but certainly to
Yeah.
what we saw up in Idaho. Um, so you have these snakes going out, and did you see them kind of like I described? They make the migration, but then say with a non-gravid female or for a male for a part of the year, did you see almost, we used to call them core areas or foraging grounds, but basically where the animals would then change their movements pretty significantly, and if you looked at their movement trajectory from the air, it almost looked like a lollipop, like with the migration being the stick to the lollipop, and then some type of polygon of circle or square, rectangle, whatever shape it might be. But this area where then the snake, is just foraging throughout the bulk of the summer. Did you see that type of pattern as well, or were there as distinct kind of, as I call them, core areas or foraging grounds, or did you notice that in these species?
Yes, we did certainly notice that in this species in particular, that when we went out and tracked certain snakes, we saw that a lot of males did make the a lot of headway and like distances traveled this year as compared to last year. But then finding out too that um, most of the time we found them certainly in ambush positions, most like close to creek beds or close to creeks, I should say, flowing water that we saw a lot of males and females occupy. Um, but still, for the most part, we had males and females somewhat still take the same sort of trajectory. They didn't really change their movement patterns as much, and one snake in particular was going on the same movement pattern as it was last year, but just hoping to cover more ground in terms of this year as compared to last year because of the time spent to wrangle the snakes, and then of course to like get them all equipped and whatnot with the transmitters to track them. Certainly probably takes a lot of toll on their physical and their physical health, of course. So they definitely need like that recovery time post the surgeries that we give the snakes to have them basically orient themselves to where they are. But for the most part, they have been taking the same sort of been taking the same movement trajectories as last year, but finding that like they definitely are occupying more of like the creeks, streams, riparian habitats, but also rocky talus sites. They seem to like flourish in. We do find a lot of the time too that when we come up on these snakes. When we're tracking, is that we find empty pine nut shells by the rock outcrops that they're um, astivating in, or we find that they're like in like really dense vegetation that consists of like woods rose or aspen or certainly like chokecherry that we have come across a lot of snakes in those really dense vegetation, also in ambush postures there. But but yeah, pretty much just seeing like sort of like the same movement trajectories expressed as like last year, but just greater lengths, I guess, this time around. But seeing certainly, like you mentioned, like that lollipop pattern and the same sort of pattern expressed here with these species.
Mhm. But it sounds like you had more directional movement, meaning if you had a given den site, more of your snakes were going in a given direction as opposed to like this wagon wheel pattern of lollipops that I described. And you mentioned a lot of habitat types, like we'll call them micro habitats, but you mentioned kind of like stream, riparian corridors. You mentioned these talus slopes where they were really drawn into,
Mm-hmm.
and some other areas. So it sounds like there's kind of a diversity of microhabitats that they're using, but there is somewhat directional movement. Is that directional movement? Is it dictated by elevation? I mean, for example, like, do you see that most snakes come out of an overwintering site and they're going up, or they're going down, or is it, how does that kind of play out?
Yeah, definitely. Like a majority of the time, they are like basically just going on one like distinct route up, ascending themselves in higher elevations there that we notice. But then they also do cut across and just create these like very like parallel lines to each other with their movement patterns that they go cut across or cut across from like where their dens are up and over ridges to basically get to another like rookery where there's potential mates there that is just horizontal to like where the dens are. And we find that they definitely do make quite a bit of a jump, from like going up and over up and over like really steep slopes, elevations to get up and over those ridges to go back down into those creeks, riparian areas, and meadows and whatnot too that we find them in.
Hmm. Okay, interesting. Well, how you mentioned earlier before we started recording, you were talking a little bit about thermal ecology, and I know that's part of your study that that you're still collecting data on and analyzing. But maybe talk a little bit about just kind of what you guys are doing, like kind of what the design was to examine the thermal ecology of these species and why, um, what the focus of that was, and uh, I'm also kind of curious what prompted this movement study in general, and what are some of kind of the big questions behind it that are driving the interest in doing this graduate project.
Yeah, definitely, Chris. So my main questions I'm seeking to answer for my masters is looking at what sort of resource selection patterns like rattlesnakes prefer in terms of foraging and or mating, and especially like a big time, like a big portion that you mentioned was thermoregulating. And so um, during during the activity season, when we know that snakes go into aestivation and they need to like seek shelter, from the hot beating sun and whatnot, I would like to better understand like why snakes utilize these like these cover types, I guess, or refugee. I think you could also say that as well, on on like where what kind of microhabitats they prefer to get out of the hot beating sun, but also to find potential mates in terms of that. But I would really want to focus on like exactly the types of temperatures that we see in the environment, compare that to what the rattlesnakes are experiencing internally, and how that plays a big role in how they bask, how they thermoregulate. So we use these operative temperature models that we're like spray paint on, or spray paint to basically mimic or look like Great Basin rattlesnakes, that we also set in place in certain areas where we have um, home ranges of these snakes that we know for a fact, they like from historical movement records, snakes have been here in this type of microhabitat. So basically correlating those operative temperature models to like what exactly is the temperature of the snakes is what I'm kind of like seeking out to answer for my how they seeking out how they thermoregulate in terms of that, depending on certain like climatic factors and environmental changes to like their ecosystem.
Yeah. And so, for the audience, maybe, when you say operative temperatures, this isn't the technical definition, but, for the audience, maybe you could think of it as like, the, if you go out and you just take an air temperature, say near a snake, that's not very likely to be the actual body temperature of the snake, because there's so many energy transfer mechanisms. You got conduction and convection and all these different factors. And so the operative models allow you to essentially estimate what a snake's temperature would be in that situation at the time. And so we used them up in Idaho as well. And essentially what we did is, again, we were looking at these disturbed versus undisturbed landscapes. So the whole cheatgrass and changing ecosystem and fire changes in fire regimes. And we were looking at kind of the envelope, meaning like the 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 warmest and the coolest temperatures, say, throughout a 24-hour period that a snake could potentially find. And then within that, we were actually measuring the snake's body temperatures with instruments inside the snake to see where they were selecting within those different environments. And this is kind of tangent now, but we found actually that in the disturbed and the undisturbed, we'll call them, it's a little more complex than that there wasn't much different in thermal opportunities, and the snakes kind of were able to select temperature regimes where they want to be, and that it was driven more by small mammal communities. But so I'm curious, I don't know how much of the data you've collected and looked at, but are you starting to see, different temperature envelopes, or available, we'll just call them available microclimates, in some of these different habitats that you're looking at? Or are you still in the process of collecting and analyzing those data?
Yeah, Chris, I'm currently like, yes, taking out all of the data loggers that I have within the snakes themselves to process and analyze that data. So I haven't really quite got to that part of my project yet in terms of like analyzing it and comparing it with those operative temperature models, to like with the live snakes that we have. But I'm hoping to
Yeah.
find some really cool
Well, that'll
stuff.
be interesting. The other thing that Oh, no, I was just going to say the other thing that really interests me is this. I keep mentioning elevation just because we didn't have any. So I'm just really curious about this, all this interplay between, you've got, elevation, but you've got snowpack, but you've got some creek beds. And so, yeah, it'll be interesting to see if that elevation gradient, yeah. And, again, you have these animals at the higher elevations that are growing faster and bigger and doing all these things. So I'd be really curious to see some of those thermal data as they come out. But go ahead, Colton. I cut you off. What were you saying there?
Oh no, you're good. I was just saying like I'm really excited to dive into processing the data and analyzing it. To obviously let you know what I find. And yeah, hopefully it'll be pretty awesome, like groundbreaking maybe, but who knows really, right?
Cool. Well, uh, I want to go back and ask Bryan another question here before we wrap up. But before I leave you, Colton, so you're getting pretty far along in your master's program. What does the future hold for you? Where do you want to be? What do you want to do when you get through with this chapter? Are you going to continue on in graduate school, or plan on working, or what's kind of the future hold?
Yeah. So, man, I'm really happy to like be given this opportunity by Bryan and my advisor to study these rattlesnakes. And I know I want to take this, drive and passion that I have for this species to, further increase my knowledge on rattlesnakes and especially like reptiles and go somewhere with it to like maybe work for a national park studying a particular species or start like a long study program on a particular species that maybe not many scientists or researchers know much about, like in terms of like it being like a viper or any snake species of that matter. But man, Arizona I think is like the best place to go if you want to like definitely research and study rattlesnakes and then just snakes in general too. But I know that there's like a lot of connections I have to make with that, and certainly kind of put my foot in the door in a lot of places to kind of get a better sense of working in that climate and get used to those temperatures there as compared to here that are certainly like really different in terms of how seasons go. But I definitely hope to like even continue this work and this summer as well to like basically finalize everything and wrap up everything that I have going on here. But certainly keep this study going as long as possible too, and then look at those look at certain like other aspects of like fire regimes that you were looking into too, Chris. Maybe look into that component as well for maybe a side project or a PhD, if possible down the road. But only time will tell, I guess, right?
Great. Well, maybe in future years you'll be in Arizona and studying some other mountaintop rattlesnakes. So, but before we begin to wrap up and take this one in for a landing, Bryan, I just wanted to kind of final question. I just want to talk about like kind of disturbance regimes and other environmental changes, whether that be changes you're noticing in climate. And, we've talked about a couple of those things, but I do think fire, if I remember correctly from what we were talking about before, was one of the real driving forces behind some of these studies. And so talk a little bit about natural disturbance regimes and the roles in these populations and how that has, um, prompted you to launch some of these studies. And you mentioned some interesting information on climate change too, and how it's changing activities. You might touch on that as well, but I'm just kind of curious about those things.
Out in the western U.S., we've really excluded fire for at least 100 years from a lot of these ecosystems, particularly in the mountains. And now I like to say that it's kind of like accumulating credit card debt. If you put out these fires and you don't allow fires to burn, the interest is all the fuels that have accumulated. And eventually, that bill comes due and we have these big catastrophic wildfires that are really damaging the plants, animals, people, water supplies. And so there's a real push right now to go out and to restore fire on the landscape. And that's done in a whole bunch of ways. But one of the main ways is you just go out and you light prescribed fires. And that's pretty common with your work with eastern diamondbacks and the eastern U.S. It's especially in the southeast. That's just been something, maybe a brief period of fire exclusion, but it was recognized pretty early that these longleaf pine ecosystems needed fire. And for the most part, management's been done pretty well towards that respect. But out west, we haven't done that, and now there's a real push to get out there do it, and that's a huge disturbance. And so, one, we don't know a lot about what these animals are doing before we put fire back into the system, and then we don't really know how they're going to respond. So we had some pre fire data for my dissertation, And the snake study sites, the study site's right over this place we're going to try to burn in the park. And then Colton's kind of gone out and done it 10 years later. So hopefully we can look at how a prescribed fire affects these rattlesnakes in terms of movement ecology and in terms of thermal biology, because it's going to have, if things go well, it's going to be a dramatically different environment next year in a year. It'll be a lot less vegetation. It should be a lot more open. And these fire exclusion effects, I mean, they're in of themselves, they're having big effects on rattlesnakes and their prey because they're just really slow. So a lot of these systems were more grasslands and shrublands, probably more like Snake River Plains. And then over time, these trees have moved in and they've shaded out, the understory's gone away, and it's dramatically decreased the small mammal availability, and it's changed the thermal ecology. It's been this really long, slow process, but over a couple of rattlesnake generations, it has that loss of productivity must be impacting their reproduction and their growth rates. Another side of that, which is more like what you worked with in the Snake River Plain, is in some places, like in the mountains, we haven't had enough fire, but in other places in the valleys, there's too much fire. So these weeds like cheatgrass, which is an annual grass, they sort of thrive on a fire cycle. So you have a fire, it changes the native vegetation, you get some cheatgrass. Then you have a second fire, get a little more cheatgrass. And over time, this feedback loop just vast millions and millions of acres in the Great Basin are no longer have any native vegetation. It's all cheatgrass. And that has really negative impacts on the prey base and on presumably rattlesnakes, which your data showed that they grow slower, they shed less, and they reproduce less in these annual grasslands. So you kind of got to, it's a conflicting stories of too much fire in some places and not enough in others. And that's why we call it fire management is, you need the right fire in the right place at the right time. And in general, there's a move to restore these more natural fire regimes, which it's more fire in the mountains, in the forest, less fire in the valleys is kind of the general paradigm that we're working under. We'd like to burn half the park, 30,000 acres in the next 20 years.
Wow. How far up in elevation, say in the park, would you predict that cheatgrass would or does go? I mean, is it something that stays below, I don't know, that 6,000, 7,000 foot, or is it going all the way up?
It's a really good question. The plants and the animals don't always read the models. There is some cheatgrass that goes pretty darn high. 8,000 feet is a pretty good cutoff. And it depends on the slope and the aspect, right, and the soil type. So at 8,000 feet on a north slope, it's not really prone to cheatgrass at all. But on a south slope, it's very, very prone. But that's a pretty good, 8,000 feet's a rough estimate. Above that, the native vegetation can win that battle. There's enough moisture that it can kind of win it. And so far, we're fortunate. It's not like the Snake River Plain where there's just miles and miles of cheatgrass as far as the eye can see. It's patchy here, and it's an issue, but it's not quite as extreme as it is in southern Idaho, which is a really lucky thing to not have to worry about it on that scale.
Yeah, northern Nevada too. What's the interstate that goes between Reno and comes up through all those towns? It reminds me of I-80 reminds me of the kind of over towards Boise, where both of those areas you drive and there are places where as far as you can see, I mean, we're talking, and you can see a long ways in a lot of these flat Great Basin or interior Columbia Basin deserts, like as far as you can see, it's just cheatgrass, like nothing else. And I've had some interesting thoughts with that too, just over the years, because it's a little different. Like, say you go out to like a Pacific Northwest, like coastal rainforest, like people really notice these clear cuts, right? But like, I think a lot of people just driving through Idaho or northern Nevada, like, I don't think they notice it. It's just not a big profile difference. And so it's just kind of like, it's not as like, oh, the whole forest is gone. And so, but it's a huge issue. It's a whole scale conversion of an ecosystem, and I do hope you can keep it out of those high elevations. But we're getting on in time, so we'll probably wrap it up there. But before we do, I like to have all of my guests tell me a really good snake story. And so, Colton, why don't you kick us off here? I want to hear a story from both of you, but Colton, why don't you tell me your best snake story?
Yeah, sure thing, Chris. I've been definitely thinking long and hard on like the story I was going to prepare for you. But I think I got a good one that you're gonna like a lot, especially knowing that it has to do with like doing radio telemetry tracking. Looking at their movement patterns in terms of being on the ground and seeing that firsthand. There was one individual in particular from a den that we had. I started tracking him like first from the beginning of the season and all the way up to the end. I was the only one that really wanted to track the snake. He was really close to my heart, and I felt like we definitely shared a little bit of a connection too over like the time span that we spent. Like basically, I spent studying him and where he was going, and I thought it was just incredible to see this one particular individual travel basically travel upward, ascending to like elevations I didn't even think Great Basin rattlesnakes could reach. And so, um, starting at roughly like 7,000 feet where his den was, he ascended up to 9,500 feet um, to almost touching the peak of this this area in Great Basin National Park that a lot of people, especially the locals here, know about. But seeing how he reached like almost like elevations of like close to 10,000 that I never even thought of like snakes reaching that until I started this project. But over the course of the activity season last year, seeing where he was going, where like why he was going up there, I never thought to myself like why the snake would be traveling up so far, you know? I mean, is there like potential food up there that he was going to try to find? And so one day I hiked up maybe 2 or 3 hours, like basically tracking this snake would take a whole day at some point because he would just keep on ascending and ascending and ascending up to like 9,500 feet. And so you're going through really dense like conifers, mountain mahogany, alpine forests that Brian was saying this is most likely that the snake he was referring to was like at tree line there, um, reaching like really really high elevations. And so one day I came up there and I found him just not too far from a patch of rocks or rock talus, that you could say too. And he's just outside of that rock just hanging out, and I was like, okay, there he is. He's just coiled up, not minding his own business or anything like that, not even really giving a care in the world that I was there either. And then sure enough, I go around the rock and I hear a rattle, and I'm like, well, I must have startled him in some sense, because I was right there. But sure enough, it wasn't that individual that I was tracking, that telemered snake that was rattling. It was a different snake. It was one single female that surprisingly was like one of the largest females I've ever seen in my study. That was like roughly 530 grams or so, or sorry, 430 grams. My bad, 430 grams. And seeing how it was just like the two of those snakes hanging out together at this one rookery that I had no idea that rookeries can even go up this far or snakes would even travel up this far. Like I just got me thinking like, man, there must be like maybe a rattlesnake up at like 9,000 or rattlesnake den, maybe up, 9,000 to 10,000 feet. Who knows where this female came from, or if like this female had like other potential mates coming towards her or coming to her from like other, hibernacula. But I just thought that that was really, really romantic. It's like a Romeo and Juliet story. I would say that, they were so far apart from each other, but they traveled so far to get to each other, and eventually met up. I just thought,
Star-crossed lovers.
yeah, exactly. I just thought that was amazing. And then
Yeah.
being able to like see the landscape, see the Snake Valley from that high up was breathtaking. And I always love, to tell people that story, that was like
Yeah.
really my best snake encounter in all, and just rattlesnakes in general being like the main focus there too, just made it that much better of an experience.
Yeah, that's great. I've had similar experiences here. I mean, these days I personally mostly work on timber rattlesnakes, but I live in the southern Appalachians, kind of near Great Smoky Mountains National Park, and so I live it's in the highest mountains in the east, and I live at the southern latitude of mountains. So, anyways, we found multiple timber rattlesnakes now going well over 5,000 feet, which for here is big, and yeah, it's just kind of amazing when they go up, up to these high elevations. So, anyways, well, Bryan, well, let's turn it over to you. Do you have a snake story for us?
Sure. Yeah, I've got one. I kind of mentioned earlier, how my perception of these snakes has changed from, because they're really just, these sentient, highly intelligent social animals. And I know we're kind of preaching to the choir. We've got a very snake conservation friendly audience here. And one of the best stories I have, my daughter, she's 16 now, and I've been taking her out doing snake stuff since she was 3 or 4. And one day or actually it was at night, we were counting toads in this really remote stream in the Mojave Desert. And I kind of had it in the back of my head that there's rattlesnakes here, but we were so focused in on toads, I didn't even really mention it or anything. And cruising up this wash, a little bit of water, and my daughter, I think she would have been 11 or 12 then, but she just launches herself straight up in the air and kind of screams and jumps back, and there's this really big speckled rattlesnake just coiled in the middle of the stream in ambush posture, totally oblivious to what's going on. And just a gorgeous snake, and we photographed it and annoyed it till it finally crawled off. But just how cool it is to have these amazing animals in these protected areas, and how gentle they are as creatures, and just what a great experience that was to get to share with my daughter in the middle of the Mojave Desert. One of the coolest animals I've ever seen. This really big, pretty speckled rattlesnake.
Yeah, that's great. And when you can get kids into it young, we know they don't always do exactly what we do, but hopefully they'll carry that with them the rest of their life, and
exactly.
Whatever they do. So that's great. Well, I enjoyed this conversation. I love talking Great Basin rattlesnakes, and this was really interesting to me because it's so different. So, but yeah, I just wanted to thank you both so much for being on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much, Chris. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Chris. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, well, no problem. And yeah, I just wanted to thank the audience and tell everybody to remember, snakes are animals too, and it's a privilege to see one in the wild.